What's the scariest true story you know? Story 1. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor, and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid that 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it, and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down. You know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids? It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. However, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick, gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva, and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. What terrifies me the most in this story is that the 2 other doctors could not bother to look under the eyelid and instead just stuffed the poor patient with tons of pills while something grew in her eye. Thank you for being a thoughtful and helpful doctor. I had something really similar happen to me. I had a swollen and painful eye for a couple of days. I thought it was an infection, but I was hoping it might just clear on its own. It kept feeling like something was stuck in it, but I'd rubbed and couldn't find anything in there. Well, after the 3rd day after vigorous rubbing, I was looking in the mirror to see if there was any visible damage, and I saw a black glob. I was able to get it out, and on close examination I could see remnants of legs and wings. It was a dead fruit fly that must have somehow gotten wedged behind my eye. The grossest thing to ever happen to me, but when I got it out, the relief was fairly instant, and the redness and swelling were gone by the next day. I'm not sleeping tonight. Story 2. The story of Jayme Closs is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin last year, a 13 to 14-year-old girl went missing after her parents were murdered in their home. Police arrived within 4 minutes or so, but she was just gone. Of course, speculation is that she was kidnapped, and that she was in on it, or dead, or whatever. Nobody knows because she has completely vanished. 88 days later, in the dead of a northern Wisconsin winter, she runs out into the street to a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes from her home. All of that is scary enough, but here's the terrifying part. She had never had any contact with the guy who murdered her family and abducted her. One day, he was just driving to a new job, at which he only lasted a day, and saw her get on the school bus. At that moment, he decided that he was going to take her. There was no warning, no grooming, there was absolutely nothing that she or her family could have done to avoid everything. A creepy young man saw her from 100 feet away and decided that he would murder her family and take her for himself. Jayme is my cousin. Of course, no one wants to assume the worst, but by the time she had managed to escape, we had all pretty much assumed she was dead. The emotional roller coaster of finding her alive after my aunt and uncle had been killed like that was insane. It was just crazy seeing the story in all of these magazines, having classmates talking to me about her without realizing my connection, seeing America grieve with my family over this tragedy, etc. For the longest time, I didn't allow myself to feel anything because I had the mentality I was too far removed, as a cousin who had only met them a couple of times, and closer family and friends had it worse than me. Then to see other people who didn't even know them crying was just weird. It almost made me mad. Now I'm getting to a better point with grieving and can appreciate the entire community coming together and stuff, but I'm still emotionally confused about the whole situation. It literally was just a bad person who decided she was the one he wanted to own. I remember that whole situation well, since around that time I was a student teaching kids about her age. In retrospect, I bet that the pandemic has been pretty good for her. I imagine being able to go out masked and covered is a godsend for somebody whose life got turned upside down because she was recognized in public. I just followed up on her, and apparently she's got a strong support system. Trauma like that doesn't have to ruin somebody's life. Hopefully, she'll get through it and live a happy one of her own. I hope she's doing well now. Story 3. The murder of the Groene family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar and got to know their routine, with the intent of kidnapping the children, 10-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta. Jed found the lock on the door was broken, entered entered the home in the middle of the night and tied up the mom and dad and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive, sexually abusing, torturing, and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan, but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is the CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station, because you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter if you were an onlooker. Eventually, he took her to a diner where he was finally apprehended when a waitress noticed something was up and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. As he was dragged away, he called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison," and she said that she would. I don't know if she ever did. Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer. But the worst part of it is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. This actually happened a few miles outside of the town I grew up in. I remember growing up hearing the story then, and again from adults at our school. She was actually saved by a waitress at Denny's who recognized her and called the cops. My stepmom also worked for the police dispatch in our county around that time, and she was there when they got the call from Denny's that she had been found. Always so creepy to realize this can happen in your own backyard. Story 4. Allison Botha. On December 18th, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Allison Botha was abducted, raped, stabbed, and left for dead by friends DeToy and Thans Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand, she had to hold in the organs spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle, the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There's a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Allison. Worth the watch, but might be traumatic for some viewers. I listened to a podcast on it, and it's so incredibly hard to listen because of how horrific this was. Luckily, you get a little hope because of the vet student who patched her up and stayed with her for an hour until the ambulance came and even went with her to the hospital and never left her side. I stayed just outside of Port Elizabeth some years ago. One night, we decided to head into town for food. The only advice we were given was, if it's dark, do not stop the car for anything other than police. Red lights, pedestrians, nope, just drive. I'm glad we listened to her. Story 5. The Raina Marroquin story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s and got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss's wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years, and none of the various owners opened it due to its weight. Finally, one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it, he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police would come to arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. A similar thing happened in the north of Croatia. A woman had apparently killed her sister and then put her body in a freezer, which she sealed with superglue. She kept her there for around 20 years in the same house where she lived with her parents, her husband, and her children. The body was found by her daughter's boyfriend when they renovated the house. Who leaves a mystery industrial barrel in a house they're buying? If it's empty, cool, sell it or use it for something. If it's not, I don't want whatever's in there to be in the house, at least not without knowing for sure what it is. A dead body is one of the better surprises you can find in an industrial barrel. Not extremely dangerous, and police will remove it for you for free. Imagine if it was half full of acid or HF or mystery hazmat waste. Sometimes people just forget those things, especially if it would be hard to remove. Story 6. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger, my twin brother and I would help our friend do his paper route. One summer, we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later when the smell was reaching down the driveway. We went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. I knew a guy who bought a house and was told by the neighbors the previous owner was an elderly recluse. She was spry up to a point, but didn't have any family or friends that she kept in touch with, and she wasn't all that friendly with the neighbors. She kept 3 German Shepherd dogs. You can see where this is going. She passes, but no one comes by, and the dogs drink the water in the toilets and eat her. When the mailman noticed the smell, they found what was left of her. The dogs were put down for fear they would be unfit as pets. The realtor never said a word. I've been an EMT for about 4 months now in an urban system, and I've responded to 2 of these circumstances. The smell is very specific and honestly horrible. Luckily, on each call, someone was there before us, fire department, and we didn't have to go in and document the obvious death. It's something that happens fairly often when older people with health problems live alone. Check in on your old people, folks. They need it. Story 7. Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his daughter in a secret room in his basement for 24 years and fathered 6 or 7 children with her. He actually planned the whole thing 6 years in advance, got a building permit, and built an inescapable apartment-like prison underneath his house. He drove miles to dispose of trash and do shopping for the imprisoned and not be recognized while doing so. Seriously messed up. He was only found out because one of the children he fathered got seriously ill and had to be taken to the hospital after spending her whole 19-year-long life underground. He claimed that his daughter, Elizabeth, thought to have been abducted by a cult, dropped the granddaughter off at his house because she wasn't able to take care of the sick young woman. Doctors found the story fishy, involved authorities, and demanded to speak to Elizabeth in order to find out what her daughter was suffering from. I read the book a few years ago. I believe 3 of the children were too fussy and the noise would raise an alarm, so individually he brought them upstairs for his wife to care for. He told the wife the daughter was in a cult and dropped the babies off in the night, and the wife never questioned it. The babies were raised to not know better. After the rescue, the upstairs kids and basement kids finally met and went to therapy together. I can't imagine either side ever fully recovering from this ordeal. They were separated from their siblings in the same house. That's heartbreaking. Story 8. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through the Arctic waters. These ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships, with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of, worked against them as much as the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice, and particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of for years, meant the entire crews of both ships were slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy, and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia, and general mental deterioration, combined with an already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2 to 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try to hike out together to the nearest trading outpost and Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains were discovered by local Inuits and other tribes who described desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cookpots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. My great-great-great-grandfather survived 3 Arctic expeditions in the mid to late 1800s, the USS Polaris expedition, the USS Jeannette expedition, and the Greely Relief expedition. 2 of them were shipwrecked, the USS Polaris and the USS Jeannette. The Polaris left him stranded for weeks on an ice floe in the Arctic with little provisions. The USS Jeannette is the most famous. The ship became trapped in the Arctic ice and slowly crushed. They eventually had to abandon ship and try to traverse through Arctic Siberia by foot for months to try and find help. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of only a few survivors of the voyage of the Jeannette. He was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor in 1890, which I recently inherited along with his pocket knife, a walrus tooth, and a polar bear tooth. Photos of him and his personal copy of the book called The Voyage of the Jeannette that chronicles the harrowing events of that expedition, with several pages of signatures with addresses of people who were living in New York City in the late 1880s pledging to purchase copies of the book. In 1901, he invented and patented an indicator and recorder for the pitch and roll of vessels. I inherited his original patent, documents, and drawings. His name was William F.C. Nindman. Story 9. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack of Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found, and other things that remained were empty cans of food and water, and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This means they were trapped there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved. And they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you were going to die and the psychological torture that goes along with it. On top of that, they would have probably died at different times, so having to be stuck with 2 dead bodies is horrible to think about. Story 10. This happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17 years old. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend, and she had the house to herself, went about her business, had dinner, watched TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side that she was lying/facing and gently stroked her hair and face and then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the forested area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely in the mid-2000s. How do I erase my memory? Story 11. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up. The plan was that her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or 2 later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry, etc. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter were found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining that she was concerned for their welfare as she had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. This is really depressing. I can't imagine the pain I'd harbor should anything like that happen to me. Story 12. The Silent Gibbon Twins. 2 sisters who rarely spoke except to each other. They were sent to separate boarding schools to get them to talk to other people, but entered severe catatonia. They were eventually hospitalized and made a pact that if one of them died, the other must speak and live a normal life. They had a months-long discussion and decided which one of them should commit suicide. Eventually, one died of heart inflammation with no causes noted on the autopsy, and just moments after the planned time, the other spoke. "I'm free at last, liberated, and at last Jennifer has given up her life for me." I'm creeped out but curious. Sounds like something straight out of The Conjuring or something. Story 13. There was a guy in my town who stalked women at the furniture store. He would watch women pick out new chairs and he would just linger there and drop these strange comments. That chair would look nice in my den. Then one night he followed one of the women home. He sneaked into their living room and then waited for them to enter the room. He'd then jump out and surprise them. He'd yell, "I knew you took my chair!" and he'd scream and chase them. This happened over the course of 5 years. The local police never did anything because he was brothers with the sheriff. Women couldn't buy furniture by themselves. They had to start bringing chaperones. Reminds me of the story of Whipping Tom. In 17th century London, he was like Jack the Ripper, accosting women on the lonely, foggy streets of London town. But instead of murdering them, he'd appear, slap their asses yelling "Spanko," and just vanish. He was so elusive that he was never caught, not even with men dressing in drag trying to lure him into a trap. I know it's not okay to touch someone like that, but for being a serial anything, a serial spanker that yells "Spanko" and running away is pretty hilarious compared to murder. Story 14. A guy I was good friends with had a party one night and called me to invite me over. It was me and my wife's first day off together in a while, and our daughter was 2 years old. I mentioned it to my wife and my daughter said, "No, don't go, Daddy." Of course I couldn't resist that, so I stayed home and we had a good night. My friend, however, had the worst night of his life. His party was going well and everything was fine, even though there was a friend of a friend there who no one really knew. Turns out the stranger had been smoking PCP and decided to start killing people. He took a butcher knife and slashed 3 people's throats. My friend's wife threw their kids out of a 2-story window and jumped out herself, took them into the woods and called the police. All 3 people died. The police found the guy walking down the side of the road covered in blood and incoherent. He had no idea what he had just done. So he said, "What really pisses me off is he was such a good guy. He was a big biker-looking teddy bear, was never a jerk to anyone and always did what was the right thing. We worked together and hit it off from day one, always ready with a joke and a smile. Maybe not going saved my life, or maybe I could have helped, but that weighs on me even 20 years later. The fact that some little POS destroyed the lives of 3 good families that he didn't even know really pisses me off, and I hope he rots in prison and gets his ass kicked every day. Rest in peace, Blaine. You were a good man." Story 15. The Ariel Castro kidnappings. Basically, a man living in Cleveland, Ohio kidnapped 3 young girls named Gina De Jesus, Amanda Berry, and Michelle Knight, and kept them prisoner in his home in Tremont for 12 years. He even had a child with one, but more often than not, if one got pregnant, he would just beat them until they miscarried. Eventually, one escaped with the help of a man named Charles Ramsey, who contacted the police. Castro was then arrested and the other 2 girls were saved. If that's not bad enough, the mother of De Jesus went on a talk show with semi-renowned and infamous psychic Sylvia Brown, who told her that her daughter had died in Japan after being sold into slavery by Vietnamese human traffickers. The girls wrote books and their experiences were so horrific. I read Amanda and Gina's book, and I can't fathom living the way they were forced to live. I used to live like 15 minutes away from there. I've driven past the place where the house used to be. It's just a big empty yard now. One of the saddest things about this story is that Amanda Berry's mother went on a talk show where a psychic told her Amanda was dead. Amanda's mother ended up dying before Amanda was free. Such a sad story. I'm not sure what Michelle and Gina are up to now, but Amanda does a local news segment in the mornings on missing kids. Those psychics are scum. I live near the Cascades and hikers go missing from time to time. There are always these mediums saying stuff like, "Susie is reaching out to me. I can feel her. I feel water and green, maybe a tree. She feels safe, but wants to come home." It's disgusting to prey on a grieving, terrified family like that. All the girls are doing well now, which is the only good part of this story. Story 16. A woman 2 blocks away from my house had multiple children and was pregnant again. I heard my mom talking about her. She has more kids than me and she is about to have another? She's crazy. Mom had 6 of us. One day, the lady wasn't pregnant anymore and there was no baby to be found. Someone told the police about it. The police questioned them and raided their home. They found the newborn dead and stuffed in the freezer. There was a creepy story that happened in Japan not that long ago. The cops found a 5-year-old and 3-year-old just wandering the streets. He asked them where they came from and they were 3 kilometers away from their house. When the cops took them home, the mother looked worried and was really apologetic about the situation. The mother was holding a baby. The cop decided to do some research on the family just in case. Files said that the baby daughter the mother was holding should have been much bigger than what he saw. Thought maybe it was a case of neglect. The two older kids walking alone was also a red flag, so they got officials to visit the house. Asked if they could have a look at the baby daughter. Turned out to be a boy, a whole year younger than the files. Ended up finding the third child buried in their backyard. Something must have happened to the baby. They quickly decided to have another kid to cover it, and were planning on raising it as the dead daughter. It's scary to think that if the newborn was a girl, and they made it to her turning 3 or 4 without anyone noticing, they probably would have gotten away with it. Recent story in South Korea was about a 3-year-old who was found starved to death in an apartment. The mother abandoned her to die. Police came and did a DNA test and found out the mother was her sister. Grandma denies she is the mother. Granddad also ended up not being the father. Mother was married and was also pregnant with a baby that was not her husband's, and there are hospital records of her giving birth, but if the daughter was her sister, no one knows where that baby is. My guess is Grandma went to the hospital as her daughter to hide the pregnancy from her husband, somehow, and made her first daughter take in and raise her sister as her daughter. She was like, screw that, and left her to die. Kicker, Grandma lived 1 floor down and never went to check on her granddaughter, while she slowly starved to death. Seems like everyone wanted that baby dead. Sad as hell. Story 17. H.G., the lone survivor of what would later be called the Wichita Massacre. She was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher at the time, and had gone to the triplex where her boyfriend, Jason Beffert, a science teacher, lived with 2 roommates. Brad Haka, a chemist, and Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a priest. H.G. settled in front of the TV and began grading papers when Heather Muller, a friend of Aaron Sanders, showed up. The 5 friends watched TV and eventually retired to their various bedrooms. H.G. was awoken from her sleep shortly after by loud voices and the bedroom door being kicked open. The 2 perps eventually gathered all of the persons in the residence and herded them into one bedroom and ordered them at gunpoint to strip. Many atrocities occurred as the hours went by, but in the end, H.G., after being shot in the head in a frozen soccer field, ran naked for almost a mile to find a house with Christmas lights. It was mid-December to beg for assistance. Investigation Discovery has an episode of Evil Kin based on the Carr brothers who committed the Wichita Massacre. They grew up in an abusive home, became small-time criminals, and then escalated by going on a crime spree. They carjacked a man and forced him to go to ATMs to empty his bank accounts, shot a 55-year-old woman in her driveway, broke into this apartment, did as mentioned here, and then went back to the apartment to ransack it for valuables, and beat one of the women's dogs to death with a golf club while they looted the place. The amazing thing is that H.G. was shot, though her hair barrette deflected the bullet a bit. She played dead, was actually run over, and then managed to still get up and go find help. She was meant to make it. Story 18. What radiation poisoning does to you if you're not lucky enough to die quickly. The worst case that I can think of outside of Chernobyl was the case of Hisashi Wichi, a Japanese plant worker who was exposed to fatal amounts of radiation, but thanks to his family and the doctors, he was kept alive against his will for 83 goddamn days. A week into the hospital, he said, "I can't take it anymore. I'm not a guinea pig." Yet the doctors continued on. When he died, all of his skin had fallen off. All of the skin grafts had fallen off. He'd lost multiple limbs, and he was suffering heart attacks multiple times a day. There are pictures of him on his hospital bed that if you've been around the internet long enough, you'll know as part of the original Shocking Images collection. It looks like it came straight out of a torture movie. I sometimes work on the grounds of a nuclear power plant and always said that if the worst happened and I was exposed to a lethal amount of radiation, that I would just kill myself rather than suffer something like that. I remember reading that he was blasted with so much radiation that doctors were unable to match or figure out which chromosome were which. It literally blasted apart his DNA. The amount of energy that hit him is thought to be equivalent to that of the hypocenter of the Hiroshima atomic bombing. It also wasn't his family. The Japanese government wanted him to live for some reason, so he was pumped daily with drugs and fluids, not usually available where he lived. Story 19. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky, and always captured my imagination. One day, a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day, they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. I went to the catacombs with a large group, and it was spooky as hell. I could not imagine going down there without a guided tour. Story 20. When I was 7, I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard and a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood, and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second, my mom called out to me from the garage, and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck started, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day about 30 years later, I jumped up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the hell? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half an hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.